Welcome to the Leading Voices in Food podcast series. I'm Kelly Brownell, Director of the World Food Policy Center at Duke University. In 2015, the member states of the United Nations adopted 17 Sustainable Development Goals and a vision for a fairer, more peaceful world in which no one is left behind. The objective of Sustainable Development Goal 2, SDG2, is zero hunger by 2030. This is an enormous task that requires the best of the world's ingenuity. Today, I'm talking with the authors of a new report entitled High-Level Commissions and Global Policymaking, Prospects for Accelerating Progress Toward SDG2. Geoff Gertz is a fellow in the Global Economy and Development Program at the Brookings Institution, and Sarah Zoubek is the Associate Director of the World Food Policy Center here at Duke University. So Geoff and Sarah, thanks so much for joining us. I'm delighted you could be here today.
Thanks, Kelly. We're looking forward to it.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
What was the original idea behind studying the potential and the limits of a new high-level commission focused on sustainable agriculture and SDG2? Sarah, let's begin with your thoughts.
Sure. Well, Kelly, in the summer of 2019, there was a group of agricultural development experts that came together and they said, global progress is stalling for achieving Sustainable Development Goal number 2. So what can we do to catalyze action? Something different we could try. And someone pitched the idea of a high-level group of individuals coming together in sort of a commission style, and they had seen some success by high-level groups like the Lancet Commission on Investing in Health, for example, and wondered how that could apply to the food security and agriculture space and if something there could be successful.
So, Geoff, what are your thoughts on this? And what do we mean by high level? Does this mean experts on a topic? Does it mean heads of agencies and countries? Does it mean heads of states? What does this mean, high-level commission?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the commissions we're talking about, they're made up of individual participants. We're not looking at groups that are business corporations or international organizations that are part of some sort of transnational coalition. Instead, we're looking at individuals who participate. And by high level, really what we're talking about is individuals who are prominent enough that they have some professional reputation outside of their immediate sphere. So this can be heads of state or former heads of state, cabinet level members, heads of large businesses, heads of international organizations. That's really the type of person that we're looking at here.
And Geoff, what roles and functions do high-level commissions serve?
So the key point in understanding the roles these commissions play and how they really work is that the commissions themselves have no formal authority. So these commissions are not issuing grants, they're not implementing their own projects. Really what they're doing is working through communications and advocacy to convince other people how to act. And so in the report, we go through several different ways that commissions fulfill this role. We see that they focus on promoting normative change. So really trying to change how do policymakers and the public think about big, important transnational challenges. They also generate and synthesize new knowledge. This is bringing new research to bear on key questions and really synthesizing what else has been done by academic experts. The third function we look at is catalyzing political action. So this is a much more sort of short-term focus on how do we convince policymakers and other people who have political power in these arenas that they need to take action on certain transnational challenges. Fourth, they also facilitate coordination among actors. And then fifth and finally, a lot of these commissions can serve as a test run for subsequent international negotiations. In a commission, you'll have a lot of these political debates in a less high stress, less high stakes manner that can then inform subsequent formal international negotiations.
Sarah, back to the point that you made when you led off this conversation, is it fair to say that given that agriculture development is not having as much impact as it needs to if SDG2 is going to be accomplished, that the only way to do this is to get people at the very highest levels together in order to create visibility and impact ultimately? Do you think that's fair to say?
Well, I think that was one idea, and there's clearly many levers that you could try to pull. Certainly, there's an attempt to try to have more bottom-up, inclusive approaches to fixing problems now, but I think the idea was, let's try this as another tool in the toolkit and see what could potentially happen. And that was the idea behind Brookings and Duke coming together to try to investigate, is that a good idea?
So thanks, Sarah. Geoff, I'd like to also hear your thoughts on how these commissions have impact. And can you give an example of a commission, say, that was successful and maybe one that wasn't so successful?
Yeah, so that's a real tough question, one that we kind of grappled with a lot in our report, because really tracing the causal impact of these missions is quite difficult. It's hard to know how would the world have looked differently if these missions didn't exist. One thing that we found is that for a lot of commissions, there's not huge evidence of impact. Even commissions involving quite high-level people come and go and don't really leave much of a trace. In media mentions, in citations, in policy and academic literature, a lot of commissions seem to be quite quickly forgotten after they wrap up. In some ways, this reflects what one of our interviews for this project told us, which is that a high-level commission is what you want to do when you want to look like you're doing something, but don't actually want to do something. And I think for a lot of these commissions, what we found is that they didn't necessarily have a real clear theory of change for how they were going to have an impact. Some that were more successful or less successful. So I think Sarah already mentioned one that was very successful, Commission for Investing in Health. That's certainly one that we look at as a very interesting case. Probably the most famous one and the most successful commission ever is the Brundtland Commission, which was a commission back in the 1980s, organized through the UN, which really defined and popularized the concept of sustainable development. And so this idea that now just completely permeates the international development landscape, most obviously in the Sustainable Development Goals, a lot of the spread of that can be traced back to the Brundtland Commission's earlier work. As far as commissions that were maybe less successful, those that face real challenges, it's often because they didn't have a clear political strategy from the get-go. The one that we look at in the report, the Aspen Food Security and Strategy Group, was a useful discussion forum, and I think lots of participants found it useful in that sense, but they never really had a clear strategy for how they're going to take the discussions they were having within that commission to a broader political and public audience. And that's where we see a lot of these commissions fall short.
Thank you. So, Sarah, after all the research that went into this report, is it possible to know, is there a recipe for success, and what can help make a commission successful in the long run?
Sure. Well, there's definitely not a perfect recipe because there's always things like world events and timing. And so you could have all the recipe correct and it could still get thrown off. But there's some things you can do to increase your chances of a commission being successful. Geoff mentioned one of them was just starting with a clear mandate and problem statement. And that sounds like a no-brainer, but there were certainly some commissions we saw that if it's not clear, you just actually spend the majority of the time agreeing on the problem statement instead of doing the work. And then also making sure that it's demand driven, that people actually really see a need for the commission and it's not just three people behind closed doors deciding that this would be a great idea. And then beyond that, it really hinges on the identity of the chairperson. You could have more than one, but they're really this kind of gravitational force that attracts other members to join. And who you invite really should be your theory of change as well for who serves on the panel, because they're going to be your best ambassadors. And you really want to often think of those individuals as representing networks of people to try to increase their reach. And then certainly you need adequate funding because you're going to need people to travel and you need, since these are often very busy people that are on the commission, you're going to need staff to support them and do some of the research. And then beyond that, things just like clear deadlines, benchmarks, in-person meetings to do some of that relationship building and get people's attention focused, although that's a little harder now in a Zoom-only pandemic world. But then also getting buy-in from relevant stakeholders throughout. We definitely saw some examples where that didn't happen, like the World Commission on Dams, for example. Initially, they involved developing countries like China and India, but then as the work progressed, those countries weren't really pleased with the direction and then they backed out. And it wound up being a very sort of NGO and civil society led process. And so they didn't really have a good process for managing internal disputes. So then ultimately, two countries that were super critical in making change didn't pay attention to the commission's recommendations. So the internal politics piece and having processes for getting through that is pretty critical. You also really need to say something new. We heard a lot, nobody wants another review of the evidence. You got to say something clear and bold and different. And then lastly, there's a great quote by Gro Harlem Brundtland who said, "A good report is not the end, but the beginning." And a lot of these commissions put together recommendations in a report and then leave it there. But the impact is better achieved if you really have a long follow-up period. And like Geoff mentioned again, the Lancet Commission on Investing in Health, they planned 2 years of follow-up. So lots of communication strategy, hosting events all over the world. So there's definitely a number of things you can do to make it more successful.
Sarah, the things you just mentioned would be pertinent to commissions of any sort. So let's talk a little more specifically about what a commission could do to help catalyze action in the food and agriculture space. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, we know that there's definitely some cautions, right? There's a large number of actors in the space. We're also moving into a time, like I said, where people are demanding more bottom up and inclusive approaches rather than ones that could be perceived as really top down and elite. And we're trying to think more holistically about development agendas. So there's definitely a danger of biting off too much. But keeping all of these in mind, we ultimately decided based on our research and our interviews that if you did it properly, a commission actually really could be helpful. And we came up with a couple ideas. One is that there's a UN Food System Summit planned for 2021. And really, with all the other events being canceled for the foreseeable future because of the pandemic, it's kind of the go-to event for food systems and a huge moment for focusing energy and attention. So the summit really is going to try to drive a change in the discourse, but also really get political commitments from countries. They've already developed a group of champions that are individuals who represent large networks, but we really think launching some kind of commission and tangent with this and coordinating closely with them could really help to forward the summit's outcomes. And then another option would just be proposing reforms to this institutional setup for food security and agriculture internationally. It's kind of a high risk, high reward proposal because it would really be a massive lift. And you'd need to have buy-in from the UN Secretary General and some other powerful governments. But so much of what we hear in the food and ag space is how fragmented it is, how there's so many overlapping mandates of different agencies, and the financing needs to be better targeted and coordinated. Like the World Food Program starting to do more development-oriented work instead of just emergency relief. And that's really the role of some of the other Rome-based agencies traditionally. So kind of need a step back and an examination of who's doing what and how to better specialize amongst those groups. And a lot of those groups were launched around emergency events. So the massive shifts in the world that we're seeing through COVID may actually open people up to thinking differently about how those institutions are structured. And then finally, we think a more narrow focus on sustainable development goal number 2 at a global level could be helpful. So some sort of specific topic with a defined problem statement and theory of change could maybe produce some traction. And 2 ideas that came up for us were a focus on food security and conflict, especially since some of the latest FAO reports show that conflict is one of the key drivers of food security globally. And the other one would be making a political case for increased investment in agriculture.
Well, thank you. This work is really important. It was a great example of a collaboration between 2 institutions, in this case, Duke University and the Brookings Institution. And this report really should have impact. It'll be interesting to see what occurs as time goes forward. So, Geoff and Sarah, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks, Kelly.
Thank you, Kelly.
And thank you for listening. If you would like to subscribe to the Leading Voices in Food podcast series, you can find it on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, or on your favorite podcast app. Podcasts and transcripts are also available on the website of the Duke World Food Policy Center. This is Kelly Brownell.